A lot has been said about test-driven development over the years, and that has ranged from a deep understanding of it to simply repeating slogans. Writing tests, and especially writing them first, can have a lot of benefits, but testing is just a tool, and tools are no substitute for proper software design. Regardless, we can't use tools without knowing how to use them, so in this week's episode we dive into testing using Mocha. Keeping with the fine tradition of descriptive names for software libraries, Mocha is a JavaScript testing framework. It works in both Node.js and the browser. Our browser-side JavaScript has at best been limited up to this point, so for now we'll only focus on the server side of things. A lot of material out there suggests installing Mocha globally. I don't like to install anything globally, so we're not going to do that. This is just a simple npm install -- save Mocha. If we're going to use Mocha, we're going to need files to run it on. I like to put all my tests under the directory test, and in this episode we're going to write a test for our user model, so let's also create the models directory under tests. Next, we'll actually create our test file. Open up test models user test.js. No part of that file name is required by Mocha, but for something we'll do in a later episode, it will be important to have test.js at the end of our file name. I think we'll see here why folks like to globally install Mocha, but I found that muscle memory helps out enough to ease this pain. The show notes will help too since I put the command in there. Anyway, to run Mocha we type /node modules mocha bin mocha and then test models user test.js. Breaking that down, npm installs Mocha into the node modules directory, and Mocha has an executable inside of itself at bin mocha. We're simply running that program and passing as a command line argument the name of the file we want to run. Now we can hit enter and huzzah! It ran. 0 tests passing, but we also had 0 failures, so we're no worse off. Let's go get us some failures and passing cases. Back up in our test file, Mocha allows us to organize our tests in a hierarchy. In this way, we can reuse portions of the setup for some tests and other ones. This is in contrast to flatter testing schemes where we just have a long list of tests to run. We start off the group by simply calling describe, which takes 2 arguments, a string and a function. The string is intended to be a descriptive name that will help us identify what we're testing. It will show up in our test results when test cases fail. In practice, at the top level of the file, I found it most useful to just put in __ file name, which is a node-supplied variable that gives us the current file's full path as a string. For a model test like this, some might prefer to put user instead, so play around with it until you find what you like best. Next, we pass in a function. It is the content of this function that will actually define our tests. We still don't have any test cases, and if we were to run this file right now, we'd get the same output as we did before. So let's add a case. Inside of the function that we passed to describe, we're going to add another call. This is a function called it, and this function is what actually defines a test case. Like describe, it takes 2 arguments, a string and a function. The string is again meant to be a descriptive name for what we're testing. Whereas the string passed to describe is supposed to describe context, the string we pass to it is supposed to explain exactly what's happening in the test. We're going to test that our password gets hashed, so let's type, say, it hashes the user's password. And then we add a function and close it out. Hey, if we run it now, we could fool ourselves into thinking we've written a good test. The test passes because we defined it and nothing failed. It's immaterial that we didn't actually test anything other than our ability to wire up some code. So I've put into here some code that looks a lot like what we have in our user routes file at app routes user routes. I've replaced rec.body with literal values for our test. If we try running this test, we see that it fails because user isn't defined. Okay, so let's grab our user model because we forgot to define it. We just go high up in the file and do a var user equals app.modeluser and we're good to go, right? Well, let's see. We come down and run our sweet test file and dope, app isn't defined. In fact, our user model hasn't been defined either. Our database hasn't been set up. We really have nothing but this file and the context Mocha provides us. That's where those mysterious it and describe functions come from. What do? We fix it, that's what. We need to invoke our app's context. We've already done this in 2 different settings. The first is in server.js when we actually fire up the app, and the other is inside of the Node REPL. In both cases, it was a one-liner to require config application. So we open test helper and require our configuration. Notice that we have to double dot config since require is relative, and we're at the test directory here, whereas every other time we've been at the app's root directory. Next, we need to add it to our test file. Again, since require calls are relative, we use the double dot to get to where the test helper actually is. We could have just required config application directly in our test file, but we'll end up with more than one test file throughout the course of the series, and we don't want to duplicate ourselves. Now when we run the test, we no longer get those undefined errors. You'll notice in that test output that we're loading the app in development mode. Our tests are going to muck about in our database, and we don't want to mess up our development environment when we do that. So, before we boot the app, we're going to directly set an environment variable in our app. That's a bit backwards, but it causes no harm and gets the job done. This will still clobber our development environment though, because we need to make one more change, this time in config application.js. At the very bottom, notice the database name that we use if we haven't supplied a database in our environment variables. Let's just make a quick change here to take into account what environment we're running in. Writing tests is a process of writing code that uses our app and making observations on the state of things after that. Node ships with an assertion library that gives us some useful functions for asserting the program is in the state we expect it to be. There are fancy modules you can use that give other flavors of asserting, but I find that Node's assert works for my purposes. I'll link to some others in the show notes that you can inspect for your own use. The first thing to do with assert is to get access to that module. Nothing earth-shattering here. Next, we want to make sure that our user is actually saved. We use assert's ifError function to do that, and pass it error, which we received in our callback. If there's an error, our test will fail. Next, let's see if our code worked like we expected it to. We'll check to see if our password hash is set to something, and make sure that it's no longer the clear text password we supplied at the beginning. Then we can just run the test to see that it's still passing. Having tests pass is nice, but if you practice TDD, you know that you actually want to see some failures along the way. Mocha sure has been a yes man up to this point, and your spidey sense may be tingling. Let's try something crazy. Let's add something that has to fail. Assert false can't possibly be valid, right? Let's see what happens when we run it. Hopefully you weren't sipping some cocoa or anything right when that happened. Pay close attention to the following because what we're about to cover has claimed many a newcomer to Mocha and Node testing and has been the cause of many swear words being uttered. Remember back in episode 1 when we said Node.js was asynchronous? Well, in the span of 14 episodes, that hasn't changed. Let's examine how this is structured. Describe takes a callback, and inside that callback we call it, which also takes a callback. We can easily verify that its callback gets called by putting in a console.log call. That callback is totally called back. Wow. But the callback in our save call is not totally called back. The callback we pass to our it call simply finishes its execution, and Mocha, seeing that there are no more tests, continues on its merry way. In this case, that means shutting down. The program terminates before we get inside that callback. It turns out we can solve this with one weird trick, and by one weird trick I mean using the API as it was designed. If a test is asynchronous, then we have to change the signature of our callback to take a single parameter. By convention, I like to call this done. Watch what happens when we run the test now. The assertion fails. Great. Let's remove it and see what happens. Error on a timeout? It's like the test just stopped working. In fact, that's pretty much exactly what happened. Because the code is now asynchronous, the test suite halts until we tell it to continue. But if we never tell it to continue, there are two choices: hang forever or fail after an arbitrary timeout. Mocha chooses the latter. We fix this by simply calling that done argument that gets passed into our function after all of our asserts. Then we run the tests again. But what? Another failure? Indeed. See, this test puts a record in our database, and our database still has that unique constraint on email addresses. We need to clear our DB out before we run the test. We're going to add a utility function in our test helper. I like to attach an object to our global apps test property. We'll give this object the property clearDB, and it's a function that will wipe the database for us. Now this requires the async node module, which we conveniently gloss over since we can black box this function for now. Don't forget to install it though with npm install -- save async. The only dive we do here is to point out this array models. We put in it the text name of each model we create, and those names should match the names that we give the models when we declare them. And at models user.js, for example, we call it user, so we put the same value here. I'm on the hunt for a better solution to this, but this process has eased the pain enough to where I haven't cared enough. If you know of a good approach, please drop it off in the comments. Okay, because we're going to have more than one test file at one point, let's make assert global in the scope of our tests by pulling the require call out of the user test file and putting it into the helper. And then we can actually use cleardb by calling it in this before each call. Before each lets us execute things before each test that we run. When we put it at the root level like we do here, root meaning outside of any describe call, it will get applied to every test we run. We can also put them inside a describe block, and then they'll get run before every test contained within that describe block. We'll see that and how we can even nest describes within other describes next week. And since we reference Mongoose, we need to require it for this file. Anyway, we could run the test now, and look at that, our test completed. As it is so many times with these introductory topics, we're just not able to cover it all in a single episode. This should be enough to get you up and running with tests in your domain layer though. We haven't covered how to test route handlers. While route handlers are just ordinary functions and you can mock rec and res objects to pass into them, there is some value in exercising them through the same flow that a browser request would hit. Next week, we'll look at route handler tests. Also, please don't take from this example that I'm saying this is an adequate test for the code we've written so far. Whether it is or isn't is something you'll answer as you gain more experience. Well, thanks for watching, and until next week, happy coding. If you've been watching the episodes and want to add any comments or questions about them, don't forget that each episode has a comments tab where you can say something. And also, the site has a feedback where you can find contact information. So if you think I'm talking too much, or maybe there are just some other topics that you want to see covered, let me know. Thanks for watching.